when I was a child, back in the day when dinosaurs ruled the earth and all of those other silly things, I didn't know anyone who was a scientist. I didn't know anyone who was an academic. In the world that I grew up in, my parents were evangelical Christians, and they raised me in a tradition of faith that was very, very different from the idea of scientific inquiry. So in a sense of faith, one of the things that we had to do was we had to study the Bible, we had to learn all of the details of the Bible, and be able to talk about them in a very cogent kind of way. But we had to accept it all. So we had to be able to hold a whole bunch of different ideas together in our heads that perhaps, if you got farther enough away, might seem contradictory. But it was considered rude or inappropriate. It just wasn't done to talk about these kind of things in that sort of environment. Now, I love my parents, I loved them then, and they supported me, and they were wonderful. And we have had a long conversation about questions about faith and questions about science. But the important thing that I want to bring up here is that I wasn't raised in a tradition of science, and I didn't know any scientists. When I went off to college, I didn't really have any sense of what I was going to be, or where I was going to go, or what I was going to do with it. It was something that I was simply leaving on a journey, on a jump, a leap of faith, if you will, that I would figure out what I was going to do with my life. But at the time that I left my parents' house to go to college, I already knew that I didn't believe in the kinds of things that they did, and I didn't want to live in that framework anymore. So I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew that I didn't want where I was leaving. But that doesn't mean that I held them with contempt or disrespect. It meant that I wanted to find something new for myself. And I think that for many of us, that's kind of a common starting place, where we're in a position where we're kind of at a crossroads, where we're at a place where we have to make a decision, but we have absolutely no idea how we're going to get there. And to me, at the time, it didn't seem very strange to not have a roadmap or to not have a way that I was going to go. Because at that time, we didn't really think about the world in that sort of way. You just kind of went out and did things. My father said, well, I'll send you to college, and you should find a smart husband. And if you don't, no, I am not kidding you. And if you don't, then you should figure out a way to support yourself. That was what I was supposed to do. So I went to college, and I was really, really good at math. And one of the things that I want to emphasize for you is that you should always know what your strengths are, because knowing what your strengths are can get you into doors that can lead to other places. So being good at math, being really good at math, and in the day when I was going to college meant that I could go to a place really high up, and I went to Caltech, which is a really good school. And the reason why I went to Caltech wasn't because it was a really good school. It was because it was 3,000 miles away from my parents. But that having been said, it gave me the distance and the separation that allowed me to figure out what I needed to do from there. And it also opened me up to a place where there was a lot of science. And science turned out to be the thing that I really, really wanted. And the reason why I wanted it is because I wanted to know things. At that age in my life, knowing things was really, really important to me. And so I started to study science. But one of the problems with how I had been raised versus trying to learn how to be a scientist has to do with the difference between learning in a classroom and practicing in a laboratory. And the reason why I say this is because when you're learning in a classroom, that's a lot not different from Bible study. You have to learn a lot of different facts, and you have to be able to explain them. But having done that, you get a good grade. Now, in the laboratory, it's very different. And the reason why it's different is because we have to identify in the laboratory where two pieces of the puzzle do not fit together. Because that's where we learn things. We learn things when they don't make sense. We learn things when we discover something we've taken for granted, something that we've believed in, turns out to be not as clear or not as correct as we thought that it might have been. I'm hoping that I'm explaining this pretty clearly, because this was really the heart of my journey, was to be able to make this transition from reading all of these things in a book to being able to think about the two little pieces and saying, but these two things can't be true at the same time. And once I started learning to do that, I started to do that everywhere in all of the parts of my life, in terms of what I was thinking of, in terms of the way that I ran my life and the people that I interacted with, the interactions that I had to bring this kind of concept in, that sometimes you can believe two things at the same time, but they can't both be true. So from there, I began in science, I began in biology, and it was because biology is the study of life, and there is nothing cooler to me. And I started to study something called developmental biology. And the reason why is because in developmental biology, you start at a beginning point, the fertilized egg, and that one cell is going to divide, and it's going to go through a stereotypical development. And when it does so, then you're going to end up with an animal. And it's really complicated, and it happens automatically. It's like it's programmed in, because it is programmed in. That's what DNA is all about. And understanding that, I thought, would be the coolest thing that I could ever do. So along the way, I fell in love. So I met my husband, and we started dating and stuck together and all of these different things. And we were in Los Angeles, because that's where Caltech is. And I was working in a laboratory after I had finished my bachelor's degree. And he was a computer science guy, still is. But he did consulting businesses, and he was trying to build this thing called the internet, because that was the next big thing at the time. So he couldn't leave Los Angeles, and I wasn't sure what to do. And I went and I was supposed to go to school in St. Louis, and I went and talked to my research advisor, and I told her that I didn't know that I wanted to go on with graduate school. So she had said, you need to go to graduate school, you can't just hang out in a laboratory, you need to actually be in charge of your science career. You need to be able to be the one to make the decisions about what you're going to do. And I believed her, but I didn't want to leave and go to St. Louis, which is where I had a graduate position set up. So she said, well, why don't you go to grad school here? I'm like, well, yeah, Caltech would be a great place to go to grad school. But I wasn't sure, because we were maybe a month from the start of the school term, and it seemed kind of late. But one of the things that I learned from her, is that actually there is an awful lot of flexibility in the system. And so while it's important to make your applications on time, and it's important to go through things through the regular channels, it turns out that's not the only way that a person can do things. She had told me that I met all the qualifications for a graduate student at Caltech. I had the test scores, I had the grades, I was what they wanted, but I hadn't made the application. But they still had slots. So one of the things that happens in basically applying to school is that the school will send out acceptances to students. The students will say yes or no, and they'll make their choices based on their situation. And sometimes the school has an extra slot or two available. And that's how I ended up at grad school at Caltech, was because I was known to the people there, and they knew that I could do the work, and they said that I could join. And so I finished my application 1 week before school started. That the registrar was not happy. Fortunately, it wasn't their decision, it was the decision of the department head. And he and I were actually friends, and he respected my work, and so I was able to get in. So one of the things that I also want to emphasize is the idea of mentorship and of choosing a mentor, because it's really a very, very important thing. So where you're at now in your career path, you absolutely need to have someone who can help steer you and help guide your thoughts and train you so that you're going to be the best scientist or the best whatever pathway you end up taking. And that person needs to be someone who knows that field inside and out. But it really, this is going to sound strange, but it really helps too that you have to pick a mentor that you can learn a lot from. And what that means sometimes is you have to pick a mentor that you have a very hard time talking to. Someone that you have to work to communicate with. Someone who sees things differently than you do, so that they can teach you how to see things the way that they see them. Now, my graduate mentor came from a completely different sort of background from me. His father was a scientist. He was a scientist. He had gotten his position at a young age. He was Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Which is a really well-funded, really big lab that focused on difficult and important questions. He and I fought. We fought a lot. We argued about many things. I was much more of a visionary type of person. I would look at something and say, but this and this means this. And he would say, what are you talking about? How can you can't be so sure. Why do you think that's even the case? How are you going to test it? And then, when I began to learn how to test things, he would come back at me and he would say, you have no idea that this is what you think it is. How do you know? So, to explain this and to bring it back into more of a pedagogy of science, what I'm talking about is a form of doing science that's called, that derives from a man named Karl Popper. And my advisor was very deep in this kind of school of thought. And what this school of thought has as a basis is, let's say that I walk outside my house and I look down and I see that the pavement is wet. Maybe I think it rained last night. But that's not the only reason why the pavement might be wet. It could be that someone was hosing it off. It could be there was a broken pipe. There could be a lot of different reasons why the pavement might be wet in front of me. And I can check to see if any of those things had happened. But in science, when we do an experiment, we come up with an answer, and we think because we designed the assay to show something, that this means that that's what it is. But there might be other explanations. And so my advisor used this technique with me, and he would say, how do you know that when you found that certain things happened, that it means what you said it was? How can you prove this to me? And he didn't give me the answer. He would let me struggle. He would let me struggle for weeks trying to answer his questions. And that's in another tradition of science from Socrates, actually. It's the classic Socratic method. And as I said, we fought, but I learned. And I learned from him, and I learned from his ways of doing science. And one of the things that I learned from this is that that was actually a very unusual training technique that people do. But this particular guy with, like this big lab actually was a fabulous scientist, still is. He works now in understanding how emotion is computed in the brain and trying to understand how certain emotional states impact the way that people act, which is a really difficult problem. But he got to that question starting with questions about development and about how the brain began, and with studying things called neural stem cells. And my thesis project was actually on neural stem cells and on making neural stem cells differentiate, trying to understand ways that this happened. So, as I had said, I was married, and my husband and I decided to have children, which is one of those moments when reason leaves you.
Sorry.
That's true. No, it is. But we had, our first attempt ended up with twins. And then our second attempt, which tells you that we were really crazy, ended up with a daughter. So the twins were boys. And then I had a little daughter as well. And when my sons were 3, one of them came down with appendicitis. Now, appendicitis is very unusual in children. And it was initially missed. But we were able to get him to the hospital in time, and so he was able to be treated without any kinds of complications. But we were very scared. And when I was at the hospital, I met another mom. Now, trust me, this is about science. So that mom had a child the same age as mine, but her daughter did not have a good prognosis. My son was going to be fine, and her daughter was not going to be fine. Her daughter had a genetic disease that affected the development of her colon. And her colon did not have enough stem cells. It really is the simple way of explaining it. We start out with a small colon when we're babies, and that colon grows to be the 30-foot long organ that's coiled up in our bellies. And the entirety of that organ is filled with neurons and glia. And those neurons and glia run your colon. And she was missing a receptor that allowed those stem cells in her colon to live and to grow. So as she grew, her colon would have places that didn't work. And she would have to go to the hospital and have those taken out. That poor child, she was 3. She had spent half her life in a hospital. She had been in constant pain all this time. And the mother knew that her daughter wasn't going to live because children with that prognosis didn't make it past 7. And I was working on neural stem cells. This is one of those crazy coincidences. I was working on the cells that her daughter didn't have enough of. But I was asking basic science questions. I wanted to know what could these cells make? What was the relationship of these cells to other cells? And all this mother needed to know was how she could get more of them for her daughter. And there was no way that I could answer that question. And you can tell that this hit me very deeply, because this meant that science wasn't just about me finding things out. Science was about trying to make a difference in this world, about making things better. As one of my colleagues tells me, it's the National Institute of Health. What are we going to do to improve health outcomes for people? So I finished, my son got better, I finished my project, and then I went home and I sat for 2 months because I was very disappointed in myself that I had spent all this time and effort to understand something, and yet I could not see how I could use it to improve people's lives. And this was a big turning point for me. I wanted to do something that would make a difference to people. And when I meet students and I talk and I counsel students, I ask them, are you someone who just wants to know? Because it's fine if you are. We need those kind of scientists. We need people who just need to know, who want to know the answer. But we also need people who want to change things and who want to make a difference. It just makes a difference what kind of project you want to do. So I had to find a project. That was the answer. My husband told me that I was making myself crazy and I needed to get back to work, and he was right. And I called up a friend of mine who had a job at a clinic, a research clinic in Los Angeles called the House Ear Institute. So the House Ear Institute was one of the groups that began work on cochlear implants back in the 60s and 70s. And they were a group that worked with people who had, I am blanking on the term, but people who have basically certain forms of conductive hearing loss. And they were able to perform surgeries to help to improve these forms of conductive hearing loss. And so they were pretty big in trying to repair cochlea and trying to repair hearing. But one of the things that they wanted to do that was a big reach was they wanted to work on something which would be cochlear regeneration. And that was because it turns out that in mammals who are damaged, whose hearing is damaged, we don't recover. But other animals, like birds and like fish, can simply replace all of the lost cells of the cochlea if they are damaged. It's amazing. You can deafen a bird, and the bird will recover, and the bird will be able to hear and discriminate songs just like it did before it was injured. Hmm?
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
I didn't either. I didn't either. When I called my friend and I was telling him that I needed a job and I needed to do something, he said, I have a project for you because you know stem cell research. And we want to bring in stem cell people to try to understand this question, because the question that he wanted to address is really a very simple one from a developmental biology standpoint. We know that mammals don't regenerate. We know that birds do. Do mammals lack the stem cells, the cells that can respond to a signal? Are those cells missing? Or is it that those cells are there, but they can't respond to the signal? Maybe the signal isn't there. Are we missing the potential for regeneration? Does that even exist in the mammalian ear? And that was a hard problem. And that was a problem that had the potential to make a difference. So I said, yes, I would like to work with you on this problem. So this particular guy trained in the same laboratory that I did. So it wasn't in this case where I was learning something completely new. It was where the two of us were taking the techniques that we learned and trying to apply them to this new problem. And what I could go through all of the biology, which is probably not necessary here. But the long and the short of it is that we discovered that in the young mouse, early in the mid-development points, there was plenty of ability in the mouse for regeneration. That the cells had the ability to replace the lost cells, but they only had that ability up to a certain point. So other people followed up our work and showed, first of all, so what we did is we took the cells, the supporting cells, the cells we hoped would be stem cells. We took those cells out of young mice and we developed a culture system to try to bring out their abilities, to drive them to differentiate into hair cells, and to also make more cells of their own kind. Once we were able to show that, and this was a big publication, actually we managed to get as high as Nature, so that tells you it was really very good. Once we had done that, other people in the field took these ideas and they first of all reproduced the work that we did, which was crucially important, and got them a Nature paper too. But then other people were able to show that the same kind of regeneration, now it's not real regeneration because it's not functional regeneration. What we're talking about is the replacement of cells, and that actually the mice could do in the animal itself, but only at very young ages. And this is really where we are at in the field itself, because what we are trying to do is we are trying to understand the signaling pathways and how the different cells might talk to each other during damage or after damage to see what kind of regeneration or repair can be elicited. But that particular pathway I got to through, again, talking to someone that I knew, someone who I trusted, and asking them for their advice on where I should go, based on this idea that I had that I wanted to make a difference in the world with the work I was going to do. So I would say that mentors are very, very important. And I say that both as a mentor, I hope I make a difference for my students, but also as a person who had to walk a path I didn't know anything about. Being able to talk to people and ask questions and trust that they would advise me on on how basically what I should do, and that advice would be good. That was really important. So being able to trust your mentor is important, and being able to believe that what they say matters is important. But the last thing that I want to talk about, do I have time? What is the, yeah, we still have a few more minutes. The last thing that I want to tell you about is about diversity, and about diversity in thought. And the reason why I understand that in a way you might feel that this is kind of silly of me to talk to you about, because everyone who is going to see this talk is someone who is in a position like where I was in, where they come from one tradition and they are looking at other traditions, where many of you don't have any examples of scientists in your own, or even people who have graduate education in your own family. And so thinking about this from where you are, you're in a very similar position to where I was. So you might think, well, I am different from the people that I want to work with. So what are we talking about? Or you say we need this sense of diversity. And what I'm trying to say about this, and what I tell my colleagues about, and how I'm working with my colleagues on this, is that what we want to do is we want to find people who really think very differently from us. It helps, it's an advantage to be someone who looks at the world in a different way. Just like my thesis advisor and I would fight because we came from different traditions of thought and we didn't see the world the same way. And honestly, at the time, we really didn't like each other very much. We didn't. But we respected each other because we were always fighting with each other. It became more of a combat and more of an action between peers than it was the kind of angry fighting that a person imagines that comes from disagreements a lot of times in your personal life. So that sort of diversity, the idea of working with people who don't agree with you, who don't believe you, who need to be convinced, who you need to explain things to, and you need to stretch to be able to talk to, those people are really useful. They're not people that you might necessarily reach for. But in my stage in my career, where I have a position, which I got because of that Nature paper, where I have this position, I have to fund my laboratory. I have to be able to get papers out. And to do that, I have to work with reviewers who don't agree with me, who don't necessarily even like me, who aren't convinced by what I tell them. So I have to learn how to teach to them. I have to explain myself. I have to be able to take small steps of logic and explain those steps of logic to them so that they think about it and so that they will look at things from my point of view. And if I can do that, then that would make me a much better scientist and make me a much better teacher. And I will change the world this way, learning to explain myself and learning to be rigorous in my thought and follow my thoughts where they're really going to go, instead of deciding that I already know what the answer is. So that's what I mean by diversity. It's not just about us all being different people from different walks of life with different abilities. It's also about finding for yourself people who think differently than you, who see things differently than you, and using their knowledge to your advantage. Are there any questions?
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. It's a very different perspective of your raising and then getting into science, and I really appreciate that perspective. We will open it for audience questions, but I would like to throw out a question to start with. Can you describe your work at the University of Rochester, just briefly, kind of in a nutshell?
So I work with mouse models because mice have hearing similar to humans, although it's at a higher frequency. But their loss of hearing in response to insult is similar to that of humans. And the genetics of mouse hearing loss is similar to that of human hearing loss. So my laboratory has two different arms, one of which is funded and one of which is not. The funded arm is the regeneration arm. And in this part, we are studying different signaling pathways that we can activate within the mouse cochlea itself to try to drive different behaviors in the cells within the cochlea. And we are testing to see whether or not these pathways will improve hearing after noise damage. So those results are still in progress. But in order to understand noise damage for regeneration, I felt that I also needed to try to learn what noise does to the cochlea. I wanted to know whether or not, if noise is applied to the cochlea, if it destroys cells or if it merely breaks them. Because a broken cell is not a cell that can be regenerated. It's already in position. If I were to regenerate the cell next to it, I would not have gotten rid of that broken cell, and that would affect the functioning of the cochlea. But the presence of broken cells themselves is an opportunity to try to understand how to repair them, how to generate new cells, not to generate new cells, but how to repair the ones that are broken and restore function to them. Because at the end of the day, I feel that it's as important to figure out ways to make the most of the cells that are there and to repair those and to improve function that way as it would be to try to do regeneration. And I think both approaches will be necessary moving forward to try to develop therapies for hearing loss.
We have a few minutes left. As a woman in science, and you went to Caltech, which is quite an elite university, and back during that time, I'm sure you didn't see very many women in science at that time, so I'm wondering if you have any comments about that experience.
So, one student in 7 at Caltech was a woman. On the biology department, which had the most women, we had 2. So there were not a lot of role models for women in science. I worked for one of them. Her name was Ellen Rothenberg, and she is still there. Ellen was a very interesting woman, and she studied T-cell development, which is not the same as neuroscience. But at the time that I was training, the graduate program actually was 50% women. So that was a big difference, and that was something that they were trying to work on at the time. It took a lot of time, it took a lot of work to change the culture so that we could start having more women at the lower levels in the graduate department. So around half of the graduate students were women, maybe 25% of the postdocs were women, and as I said, only 2 of the faculty members were. And so that made the pipeline look a lot more like a funnel and not so much like that it was going to work. And on top of that, the idea that you could also do something like have a family was completely ludicrous from the point of view of most of my mentors. A woman had to prove her devotion to science because we were not trustworthy. So that wasn't a lot of fun. But I sort of had a secret weapon in my whole family and life sort of career. And that was that my husband's older brother was disabled. He had diabetic complications. He later in his life had hearing loss and vision loss and became confined to a wheelchair. But he needed something to live for, and I had children, and he lived with us, and he became a parent to my children. So my kids grew up with the idea that you had 3 adults in the house, and they were very surprised when they got to school and found out that was not the norm. But with there being 3 adults, and especially with one of them being confined to home oftentimes because it was hard for him to work, it became a lot easier to balance a family and a career, especially as a woman. But I can't not say that I have to say, it's better, I have to say that my husband's support was absolutely crucial throughout this. So he had wanted to be a scientist himself, but he had gotten instead into computers on the advice of one of his advisors. And so he enjoyed very much the fact that I was in science and we could talk science, and the fact that this was something that we continued with. And we discuss physics and math, which is his baby, and we talk about neuroscience, which is mine, and hearing research. But that relationship and that ongoing conversation, his support was something that was very crucial in making me feel that this was something that was even possible. So it's true that it was not a good time in terms of when I started, that science, women in science was very difficult. And it's gotten easier, but it's not where I think that it could be in terms of making things better. Even today, I think that women in science tend to run into more revisions in a paper. There's more, the criticisms that are directed to you in grants are sometimes personal. There's a lot of, if you like, there's a wind, there's a headwind. But I think that in time we might be able to achieve parity, but we're certainly not there yet.